All right, welcome back. Picking up where we left off last time we discussed politics, and that took the better part of 45 minutes. Um, Everything's going up on my YouTube channel, so be sure to check that out. Moving on, the next chapter is on setbacks, resilience, and composure. So I like to hire adults. And you might say, well, duh, because child labor laws, but that's not what I mean. I have a definition of, what do I mean in the professional context of adult? Because I think we've all met people in offices that are, they have their skills and they have a function, but they're not necessarily adults. They behave in, immature ways. And I have sort of two simple tests for if someone is an adult in my definition in the workplace. One is basic. Do you think before you speak? And I know a lot of people that don't, not that many, but I think we've all encountered the types that just say whatever pops into their head. I was totally that person early in my career, and I'm pretty embarrassed to admit that, but it is what it is. And the other is, can you take a punch? And I don't mean a physical punch. I mean, can you take direct, unpleasant feedback? And not everybody can. And we've talked a little bit about feedback. Feedback is a gift and so on and so forth. If you're shutting yourself off from feedback, then you are stunting your growth. And so these are really foundational pieces to being in a position of leadership. You basically will not be given a leadership role if you don't meet at least those two criteria. I'm sure there are others, but this is really about, composure. So having said that, if you act like an adult, you're more likely to get treated like an adult. I mean, it seems obvious to say it out loud, but it's true. If you want to be put in a position of responsibility, you have to act like you can be trusted with that responsibility. And I look back on my first leadership role. Honestly, I'm not sure what Hugh Martin was thinking, like, other than he could probably figure out how to coach me into being competent. And it certainly didn't come naturally. And I did not meet these two criteria when I was given my first role. It was sort of just good luck in some ways. And what people used to say about me in that first leadership role is like, well, the good news is if you're in a good mood, everybody knows. And the bad news is if you're in a bad mood, everybody knows. So that's not entirely bad. It's only about half bad. If you're in a good mood, it's fine that everybody knows it. But if you're in a bad mood, you better have the poker face. You better keep it to yourself, because that's an example of you're a force multiplier in a leadership role. Because if people are worried about, their manager being in a foul mood, if they don't know exactly why that is, they might worry about, are layoffs coming? What does that person know in, they're privy, what are they privy to that I am not? Is there anything that is going to affect my livelihood and my career? And of course, there's lots of reasons, you can be in a good mood or a bad mood at the office. Quite frankly, most of them are probably personal. But if you are in a bad mood, then it's not, it doesn't, it affects people that aren't just you, right? It might put people in a place where they avoid you. So you're impairing that ability to do your job. They might have some bad news and they're like, oh, I don't want to bring that person bad news now because they're not feeling good or whatever. And bad news is not something typically that can wait. So always make sure that you're presenting in leadership a professional demeanor. And the word professional can be abused just as well as it can be used properly. In some cases, people will use that like the right uses woke these days, which is basically a word that means anything I don't like. So professional, what does that mean? Well, I mean, we could go look back at all the different topics we've covered in this curriculum and like, oh, okay, this is what this would sort of go under professional and that wouldn't, whether it's the way you speak or your attire or, all that stuff. So, by and large, if you've got negative emotions going on, my rule of thumb is you better have a really good poker face unless, you have some really good reason to, make an impression on someone. My boss at PacBio, when I was screwing up, if he thought that that was the only way to get through to me, he would intentionally sort of drop the mask a little bit because that was what he thought was going to be effective to someone that was as naive and not maybe the best listener in the world as I was at that time in my life. So, and you should always be able to vent in your manager's office, right? Like it's okay to like have these feelings again. And if you need to talk to somebody at the office about being pissed off or sad or frustrated or whatever, you should have a safe space with your boss, and your boss should never hold that against you. And ideally, that's something that is that they make clear to you that sanctuary, the closed door office for say the one-on-one is a safe space where everybody can speak fairly freely. But outside of that, be real freaking careful. There's also sort of a difference between venting and commiserating. Like venting is you're talking typically about some situation or person that's not directly involved with the person you're talking to, right? So like it's one thing if everybody missed their bonus and you're sitting around in the dining hall with a bunch of your peers, right? And you can commiserating is okay if everybody's in the same boat and everybody's like that sucks or whatever, right? But like using your peers is sort of like, this thing happened the other day and so is being shitty, and I'm like anything that reeks of edging into gossip or shit talking other people or whatever, unless you've got something very specific in mind you're trying to accomplish. And that sort of dotted line connects to politics. You can run smear campaigns on people, but those are risky. I mean, you have to really know what you're doing. You have to be subtle enough about it so that if you are talking, down on somebody, then the people that you're communicating this to know that it's not, with sort of that it's not goal directed. Because the moment like it smells goal directed, you're much more likely that whatever your secret plan is going to backfire. And like definitely don't bitch to other people outside of the context of commiserating, unless it's your boss. I call that toxic Johnny Appleseed, right? Like you're just going around saying, oh, this thing sucks or that person sucks or whatever. You're basically just propagating negativity, and it might make you feel better for a minute or two or five, but all you're doing is just propagating shit. And again, like it's not that you're not allowed to talk about stuff. You totally are. It's just about set and setting. You can talk about it to your boss. You can talk about it to your spouse. You can talk about it to your therapist. You can talk about it to people outside the company if they're going to be discreet. You can even have like maybe one or two people in the office who are your sort of office confidants, your office therapist or whatever. But again, if you're really thoughtful and careful about that stuff, and if you're gonna say things that you wouldn't want widely propagated, make sure there's a real clear understanding. Because if that person has any reason to come back at you or whatever, you're basically giving them evidence that you're a shit talker or not acting professionally, so they say. But when it comes to those situations that do cause you frustration or anger or whatever, right? A lot of times it'll be somebody else's mistake, or it might very well be your mistake. And in each case, there's opportunities to learn from any kind of setback, right? If it's other people's mistakes, even if it's causing you a world of hurt, you can notice where potentially that came from, whether it's, somebody's incompetence or just not paying attention, or it could be just bad process, bad procedure, what have you, right? It's always an opportunity to learn, but especially if you mess up. Um, nobody likes to make mistakes, not that I know of, but boy, are they valuable teachers. Like, you get a very, very, specific lesson. You should value that in the same way, that you value feedback. And it's also really important to own stuff, right? In an environment where you're worried about saving face or maintaining your political stature or whatever, there's a lot of, corporate cultures, or even, just smaller subsets of the org where, blame is to be avoided at all costs. And you can certainly engineer situations. My friend Venkat refers to them as heads I win, tails you lose, so that you can make gambles, place bets, or whatever, such that that even if the outcome is negative, it won't be your fault or whatever. But like, if it's clearly your fault, just own it. Like, there's really not that much to be gained from sort of evading responsibility on something, because it's highly likely that people above you in the org who are more experienced, potentially wiser, potentially smarter than you are going to spot it, right? They're going to be like, okay, yeah, so and so claims that this other person was responsible, what have you, but we know the truth. And certainly don't try to, if you're gonna try to weasel out on something, I don't even know like what a reasonable option would be. Like, blaming one of your direct reports, not unless you're planning on firing them and that they already have a terrible reputation. You might be able to slough a little something onto somebody that way, but I don't know, for me that doesn't feel good. Lessons are valuable. Like, learning is valuable. And when I do interviews, I talk about the time I almost got fired at PacBio. And sometimes that raises a little eyebrows. Oh, really? You're telling me about the time you really fucked up? And if that ever gets questioned in an interview cycle, I say, I'm telling you this because I want to show you the blast radius if I have never made a mistake anywhere near this topic again, because I learned my ding dang lesson. So and like, this stuff isn't easy, right? Like, making mistakes and keeping your head up is hard. Feeling put upon or sad or angry, like, you don't have to do much self-regulation for the fun feelings, joy, excitement, or whatever. Although even those, you want to be thoughtful about how you present yourself. Like, if you get a raise or promotion or something, like, you don't want to make a huge deal out of it inside the company for because you don't want to create jealousy or envy or whatever. But by and large, emotional self-regulation is one of those sort of key traits to cultivate in a leadership role, right? It puts you in a place where you're able to respond to situations rather than react to situations. And I didn't write it down, but I think having a therapist, at least while you're getting started, or a leadership coach or something like that. And I'm not pitching my business here or anything, but having somebody outside the company to commiserate with or just bounce ideas off of, or someone that's more experienced than you to sort of compare notes with, and see if you're seeing things the same way as others. I just think it's a good idea. I've had sort of multiple people fill that role over the years. All right, setbacks, resilience, composure. Questions, comments, anything you think I left out? All right, carrying on then. So, pretty big jump here conceptually to the notion of growth curves. Growth curves are how I describe where people are in their career. And I think this is where like a diagram would be really helpful. And maybe I need a little picture, but when people start out in whatever role, they're presumably learning a lot, especially if they're fresh out of college or something and they have a bunch of basics, but no, real career experience or whatever. So what you're looking to assess is how fast is that person learning, right? So that's kind of the slope. And you want to develop a sense for sort of assessing everybody's slope because you're trying to maximize that slope. So there's the slope, and then there's sort of call it the maximum altitude, right? Everybody's going to start out learning something presumably more quickly, or maybe that there's like an initial sort of knee in the curve and then a bunch of things click and then it really takes off. But eventually everybody's going to sort of asymptotically approach whatever their limit is, right? No matter how much you train or you run or whatever, you're never going to beat, some maximum, or I should say minimum mile speed or maximum velocity that you can run for, 10 miles or a marathon or what have you. So when someone walks in the door for an interview, or someone comes into your organization, or you're just like keeping an eye on somebody that reports to you, you're trying to keep like a constant sense of like, are they climbing the learning curve? And if they are, like, is that reasonably steep? Or if they're like, pretty much capped out at whatever it is that they're doing, is that level sort of high enough to, justify their position at the company? Most times the answer is yes, but it'll certainly play into review times. And sometimes people never kind of get it enough to where, maybe 6 months or a year into their tenure, you're like, okay, well, I really thought that person was here, with some, growth curve remaining, that their sort of ceiling would continue to inch a little bit higher, but like, boy, am I not seeing that. And I'm not going to name any names, but I think we probably have all, met those people where like, gosh, they have the credentials, they have the experience or whatever, but they're just not, executing at a level that you would hope for or expect or really need in a given position, right? So you've got the rate of change, and then there's sort of the the likely ceiling, or in some cases, like someone's been doing the same job for 20 years or whatever, like wherever they are is wherever they are, and yeah, you hope that people continue to learn and develop or whatever, but realistically, when you've been doing the same thing for a long time, it's a lot of running in place to stand still. To the extent that you're still learning new stuff, it's because the business environment is changing, the technological environment is changing, there's some new language, there's new tool or whatever. And it doesn't necessarily mean you're becoming better. It means that you're replacing a certain set of skills, muscle memory, what have you, tooling, language expertise, or whatever, with another, right? So that can be, even with constant lifetime learning, kind of bumping along. At some point, you're just not going to be a better Python programmer than you are today. At some point, you're just not going to be a better system architect, or at least not, measurably so, or very difficult to perceive, whatever that difference is. And, keep in mind, of course, I say this a lot, all models are wrong. Some models are useful. I'm taking a very simplified approach here. And the thing is that people in their professional roles are on a lot of different growth curves, right? There might be the proficiency in a language growth curve. There might be the proficiency with the tooling, proficiency with architecture and system design and what have you. But making sure that you have like some decent idea of where people are on their curves is an important part of sort of managing their career. And you want to sort of, check in on people that seem like they're not making a ton of progress. Like, okay, do you need something new to keep it fresh? Like Seth was a pretty good example of that. Seth really, I think a lot of people have perceived this as well, that he had sort of capped out as an engineer, and actually he had kind of capped out as an engineer maybe 3 or 4 years ago, based on, sort of a lack of demonstrated interest in, continuing to keep up with sort of, what modern tooling and design and so on and so forth were. And that was an important revelation to him, that he wanted to get on a different growth curve. He wanted to get on the leadership growth curve because he was sort of like, okay, I'm capped out. And that was one of my original motivations for trying my hand at management as well, is that like, okay, I'm just not getting any better as a programmer. Like I still enjoy it and whatever, but like being on that slope is important to me. If I'm not like showing visible progress, then I get frustrated and I get bored and I tend to wander off to go find something that, I'm maybe not as good at, but I can get better and I can perceive that ramp in my own development. And I sure put myself on that curve when I switched over from engineer to manager, because my curve wasn't all that steep and my ceiling was completely unknown. How long it would take me to get there and whether or not I've even reached it yet is still open to debate. But the fact is that I still, have the good fortune to feel like I can approach things to some extent, maybe not with beginner's mind, but with that sort of humility that I know I'm not as good as this as I could be, and I still have room to improve in a way that's not just sort of running to stand still. So, when I say, your growth curve, I really mean growth curves, plural, and making sure that people are somewhere on, one or more curves, and like just having that sense, right, is going to tell you like, how much you're going to be able to, get out of them. But also, you're looking for ways to maximize these. Also, I don't know what I put, what ABC here is. And I'm irritated with myself. I'll have to go back and figure that out. But when you're in a leadership position, hopefully, if you're a conscientious leader and you're trying to get the best out of your people, because it's the right thing to do, but also it's good for the org and so on and so forth. There's a lot of different techniques to improve that, and maybe maximize is the wrong word, but improve people's growth curves, right? So, providing novel work whenever possible, keeping things fresh. I think it's important to not over rely on someone like in whatever their current role is, because if you just ask them to do the same damn thing over and over and over again, they're going to get bored and wander off. Potentially they'll be ripe for being hired elsewhere. You get occasionally people that like have that one thing that they do really well, or that really narrow set of things, and they're just happy as can be, sort of tootling along in that level, but that's relatively less common. Pairing juniors and seniors is a good way to help people get ahead for a variety of reasons, and not just for the junior person. And oftentimes that a more senior person finds that they learn when they're having to articulate what it is they think they know or they do know to someone who is, the person they're pairing with. I'm hesitant to call them a student, but when you're pairing with someone of less seniority or skill or whatever the thing is, then it can stretch you a little bit to be able to communicate that clearly. And of course, teaching is its own skill, right? So even if the skill that's being developed by the mentor is just the skill of being a mentor, skill of teaching a particular set of skills, that's also a thing that's worth learning, that they can take into other contexts and teach other people. You've always got the possibility of training and continuing education. You can send people to conferences and trade shows and Coursera and all that thing. And again, some companies don't want to pay for that stuff. They're worried about, oh, well, if we make this person too good, then they're going to be too expensive. Or if we make them too knowledgeable, then they're going to ask for a promotion and we don't have room for that, and they're going to get mad and they're going to leave, or whatever it is. But I think that the risk in those cases is more than offset by the fact that people that get stagnated are less engaged, they're less interested, they tend to not keep up in ways that are important. So again, it's situational. You have to use these as sort of high level guidelines, but always be adapting them to your local circumstances. One thing we did a little bit at Lacuna was rotations, where people could go and hang out with another group, and you had to set that up. You had to set up some expectations, and you had to make sure that the group that they were going to sort of intern with had the bandwidth, and you had to make sure that the person that was going to go over there also had a little bit of flexibility in terms of their deliverables, that they would have a chance to work on something that wasn't necessarily square in the center of their expertise, but wasn't going to cause any schedules to slip or whatever. Incentives can be powerful. Now, I like people generally who are sort of internally motivated, but you can use this sort of the definition of a given job title or whatever. If you know somebody that is ambitious and they're really bucking for staff or whatever, and you say, well, in order to get to staff, you have to do this, that, and the other thing. Sometimes that'll motivate people to work. Setting expectations is also really helpful in terms of like, I'm expecting you to get better at your job every year to some degree, right? Like, this is not a place where you can sit and coast. This is not a retirement job. This is not Google. And being clear about that, gives people a framework to sort of reason about how they'll be measured, how that's going to come up at review time, at bonus time, or whatever that might be. Also like just know what people want, like really having a good model of the people that report to you, knowing their ambition level, like how much do you have to feed them, how aggressively, and how on your toes do you have to be to stay ahead of them. Anything that you're going to sort of directly teach hands-on, you better be able to articulate it well. Like, it's harder to teach a thing than it is to just like be good at a thing, generally. And having, again, the job descriptions is also really useful for that. So this gets used at review time, it gets used at interview time, it gets used at transfers, taking over a team, all that. These are the times when you're going to want to sit down and like think about people's growth curves and keep good notes in your your whatever document you do for sort of tracking individuals. All right, we went through that reasonably quickly. Questions, comments about growth curves? All right, I think I'll probably end up folding this next chapter, chain of command. It's a short one. I think it probably is a subset of something else, but the way it occurred to me, I just put it here and say, well, we'll describe it the way I have it written. So this is another example where I'll probably having diagrams would help, but I'll try to describe it as best I can. I think it's not that hard. So when you become a manager, one of the things that happens is that you've got a lot more surface area. You go from being a leaf node to being an interior node on the tree. Now, of course, you're a leaf node at first in the management chain, but you go from, basically having a boss and some peers that you work with and talk to or whatever, but you don't have any authority over them or whatever. Now you've got a bunch of people that are reporting to you. You've got your peers who are more likely to be in different skill sets and have different needs and asks and so on from you. And then you've got your boss. But the higher you go, the more likely it is you'll have to interface in a negotiation or getting your own needs met or whatever from other groups that have different priorities and have different skill sets, potentially different areas of expertise, right? The higher you go, the more you're going to be dealing probably with your colleagues in product, for example, or your colleagues in QA or DevOps or design or customer service or whatever. And these aren't just, other people, even in the engineering organization. And the more likely it is that you'll have contact with, regular contact, directors and VPs and all that stuff. Okay. Why is all that preview necessary? Well, the more sort of exposure you have to other parts of the organization, the more you might have somebody elsewhere in the organization that you need something from, or that you think is, screwing up, or, is not exhibiting professional behavior or whatever. And the question is, how do you deal with that? Well, by and large, I think it's important to stick to the chain of command. And when I talk about that, I mean that you're talking generally at 90-degree angles. So you can talk to your peers directly and try to influence them. You can talk to your boss directly and try to influence your boss. And you can directly influence the people that report to you. But let's say there's somebody in an adjacent organization, say a director in product land or an individual contributor in product land, right? And you've got some issue with them. If you talk to them directly, I mean, you obviously can talk to them at lunch or the water cooler or whatever, but if you're going to like have like a discussion about something important, right? If they're not your peers, if they're not sort of at the same level of the organization, if not like the person that you're assigned to work with, with the sort of roughly the same power level, now you're starting to cut across, these diagonals. So if you're talking to, say, you're a line manager in engineering and you're talking to a director in product, you really probably want your boss to be in the loop there for a variety of reasons. Like if you've got a problem with that person, or you got a problem with somebody in that org, and that's how you're trying to solve it, this is really where, like, if you're a line manager, you want to pop it up and feed this information to your boss, that probably a director, possibly a VP, and then they can go horizontally and then work their way down. Where you don't want to end up is getting in a position where people are like, why is this your business, or what authority do you have here? And hopefully everybody's like treating each other like human beings, and we're all just trying to solve problems and whatever. But when things get tense, whenever there's any risk of blame being assigned for something, or you feel like your ability to execute, deliver, whatever is impaired by somebody, and you're gonna got to get them to ship up, you don't have any authority over people like that. And it can just create sort of an awkward situation where you're not going to be effective, or you're much less likely to be effective. So, and of course, the other thing about chain of command is, don't jump it if you can possibly help it. Like, if you think your boss is screwing up, like, you can go over your boss's head, but it's one of the more uncomfortable experiences of being in leadership, is having somebody go over your head. And I used to do it all the time. I was terrible early in my career, especially, being in companies where I was like pals with the CEO. I would make people uncomfortable, but also, I would just wander over into, sales. I'm like, hey, do you guys need any software? Manufacturing. Hey, do you guys need any software? And the fact that I was just completely going outside of channels meant that, when I would write a cool feature for sales or manufacturing or ops or whatever, right, like, it would just absolutely, freak out the people in, say, QA. They'd be like, what is this feature? We don't have any documentation for this. We don't have a test plan for this. You can't ship this. And I'm like, oh, no, just ignore that. Like, that's only going to be used by the salespeople. And they're like, I'm supposed to what? So you can sort of create ill will, maybe without intending to, if you think that you're just going to like freelance in the scope of the org. But also, like, if you try to tell somebody to do something or shape up or whatever, if you sort of theoretically outrank them. So let's say, I had an issue with an individual contributor in a product group or whatever. And of course, we all know that the relationship between product and engineering is typically very important to get right. If there's some product person that I think is messing up, right? I mean, sure, I can bark at them, but at the end of the day, are they really going to listen to me? Like, again, let's talk about, effectiveness, right? It might feel good to be like, oh, I've got title, I can tell that IC, to shape up or whatever. But if they don't report to you, you just looks foolish, right? Ultimately, you might have some input on their review or their promotion or whatever, if there's like, 360 reviews or what have you. But by and large, you just look foolish. But also, like, if I had a direct report and, say, some manager in product was like barking at my direct report and not including me, right? I feel like different types of discomfort. I feel, discomfort that, like, I didn't see this behavior and correct it myself. Okay, maybe that's unavoidable, but I should be, given the opportunity to correct my mistake, hopefully. But also to sort of make that part of how I measure that person, how I hold, my direct report accountable, how I coach them. It's not all about stick. It's about, sometimes it's about carrots. Sometimes it's about learning opportunities or whatever. But the absolute infuriating part is where somebody comes in from another org and tells one of your people, this is really important, drop what you're doing. A lot of people will have the wherewithal. Some ICs will be like, I don't take orders from you, right? But like when that order is coming diagonally, like let's say it was the VP of product came and told one of my direct reports, I'm a line manager, do this thing. Well, that's totally screwing me over as that line manager, because I've got a team, I've got people, I've got them assigned tasks to the best of my knowledge according to the priorities of the company and this person's skill set and what have you. But if I got other people bombing in and like, giving them, contradictory information without telling me, it's a huge problem. Like if they really need something, if like the VP of product really needs something, VP of product should tell VP of engineering, and VP of engineering should rejigger the priorities in a way that like everybody knows, right? That we know that I'm not going to be surprised. Hey, how come you didn't get this thing done? Oh, well, so-and-so VP product told me I needed to stop and do this other thing. Or we all saw this at Lacuna from time to time, that somebody in customer support would just bomb in out of nowhere and say, you have to do this thing right away, or the wheels are going to come off, or whatever. And I suppose on rare occasion that's true, but like it's not going to take really that much longer to just talk to the person who's ultimately responsible for managing that person or delivering or what have you. So and also ask your manager, like don't do that to me. Don't put me in a position where I have to respond to orders from outside the order. I need to have one boss. I need to have one set of marching orders, and I can't have sort of co-equal priorities either. I can't have sort of multiple people competing for my time. Somebody has to be sort of the priority decider. So at the end of the day, any of this sort of outside of the 90s, up, down, left, right, creates surprise. And how many times have I said, your job is minimize surprise. Questions about communication pathways and sticking to the chain of command? All right. This has been a pretty demanding class for me, and I can't exactly tell you why, but I'm running out of steam. I think I can limp through 46, and we can call it a day. All right. So this is the next section is called strong opinions weakly held. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's a way of having a way of sort of clarifying how one sort of acquires and maintains opinions and decisions. And probably this is somewhere in the the overall greater framework of decision making. So imagine another one of my 2x2s, right? And you've got the sort of strongly held, weakly held opinion, which is how easily can your mind be changed. And then the vertical, call it the strong opinion, weak opinion quadrant. So if you have strong opinions, strongly held, you're basically a zealot and nobody can ever tell you anything. So that's kind of a problem right there. But the opposite quadrant of weak opinions, weakly held, is, you're kind of wishy-washy, right? Like, you never have an opinion on, anything, or at least nothing that you're willing to stick out your neck for. And, each of these polarities is problematic from a leadership perspective. The strong opinion, strongly held, means that you're never going to correct in all likelihood. You have beliefs that are unchallengeable, and that's one end. The other end is this wishy-washy, like I don't know, whatever you want, right? Like people don't want leaders most of the time to say whatever, unless it's in the context of like, this decision is too small for me to care about, I trust you to exercise your judgment, right? In which case you're granting people autonomy and agency. But I think generally leaders are paid to lead, which means we're going to do it this way, bias towards action. So that's where the strong opinions come in, right? If someone asks you a question about how a thing ought to be done or what the priorities or whatever are, you should have an answer, right? So that people aren't like sitting around wondering, or when they sit down to do a thing, and they don't really have any confidence that that's, the thing that they're doing is the most important thing. And part of their brain is like, is this really what I should be focusing on, what if I about this other stuff or whatever. Like, you give people peace of mind when you express an opinion with, you know, some conviction and some firmness. On the other hand, you got to be willing to be wrong, and you got to be willing to adapt and learn and change, right? And that's the weakly held part of it. Like, if someone can convince you that you're doing it wrong, you should sort of snap from, you know, your old strong opinion to your new strong opinion, right? There needs to be, you know, sort of enough impetus to justify a change, and you should tell people, you know, sort of what that change is. You know, and the barrier has to be reasonably high. Like, it doesn't, you don't want to be like sort of bouncing from thing to thing, and you certainly don't want to be like going back on your decisions all that often. I mean, maybe once in a blue moon, but not very often, because then that instills a lack of like, well, is the answer still going to be the same answer tomorrow? I mean, most of the time, the answer needs to be the same so that people aren't constantly wondering, not recomputing, you know, their, you know, priorities, switching gears, you know, things like that. And, you know, then there's, at times, you're just going to get flat out overridden, right? And you might not sort of internally change your opinion on something, but you might get told point blank, possibly behind closed doors, this is how it is, right? And so sometimes you have to take whatever your strong opinion is and just put that on a shelf and say, well, if I ever am in a position to change the mind of the person who gets to decide these things, okay, I might try that. But like, basically at that point, like, okay, you're taking orders. And that's, you know, sort of, this is adjacent to, you know, sometimes, you know, dissent and commit, right? You're not always going to agree with every single decision, but if you sit and just like dig in your heels, you're potentially putting the whole org's efficacy at risk. And, you know, when you're making decisions or establishing policies or whatever, that sometimes it doesn't matter how good, you know, the argument is or what your gut tells you or whatever. Sometimes decision making is really complex and multidimensional. You know, maybe not the most complicated example, but like consider tech debt, right? Like, I know tech debt kind of gives me a rash, and I like to build for long-term speed over short-term speed. But those are my sort of natural inclinations. And you can do things like, you know, argue for hackathons and whatever. You know, you can make your best case up the chain of command that we need to spend a certain amount of time on that. But again, you can't like lay down any sort of absolutes. You make your best case, you present that to, you know, engineering leadership, whether it's just your boss or a number of other people at the, you know, director and up level. And then once some sort of consensus is reached, you know, you've got a party line and you're going to toe it. And like, even if it makes you kind of queasy, you're going to go and tell your people that this is how it is and be like, yeah, I know. I totally empathize. I totally understand where you're coming from. Don't ever give the impression, if you can help it, that like, you know, you secretly agree with them, but oh, my hands are tied or whatever. Like, then you're kind of throwing the people up the chain of command or your peers or whoever made the decision, you're kind of throwing them under the bus. You're casting shade. Like, once like you've committed to something, like you kind of have to commit to it, you know, sort of no matter what you might privately think. And this is where you can still complain to your boss, you can still complain to your spouse, you can still complain to your therapist, but you don't keep re-adjudicating it unless there's a really good reason to do so. You know, aspects of companies are complex, and you might not always have visibility into all the levels of complexity. You might have visibility into complexity that you are, for good reasons, not allowed to communicate to the rank and file. And I don't have like a really clear-cut example right here, right now, but I think, you know, everybody's intuition is like, yep, sometimes you just don't know everything and you take orders. You know, again, as much as possible, I try to foster autonomy and agency. I try to give people as much information as I can and let them exercise their judgment. I think that the more information people have generally, the better decisions they're going to make than just, you know, being obedient, you know, ticket grinders. But again, you have to develop a sense of like, when is it time to just sort of trust your people to go and run with something versus, that what they're likely to do is at odds with your boss or your boss's boss or the CEO or whatever. So, you have to be thoughtful about these things. And there's no simple cookie cutter template for this stuff. And this is one of the things that makes management so hard. You're constantly having to exercise, judgment and, I mean, maybe for lack of a better word, taste. And it takes time to develop that, know when to hold them and know when to fold them. So, all right. Strong opinions, weakly held. Questions, comments?
Yeah, I guess it's not a really well-formed question yet, but do you have any like strategies for knowing when to kind of like solicit more group decisions or group opinion feedback versus like when to make an executive decision? Because I noticed that like sometimes there'll be like one or two or three people that are like really opinionated about most things in the group. And then like it's kind of like pulling teeth to get feedback from other people who should care about opinions on
Yep.
these things. And other times like it can turn into a giant like time wasting exercise where it's like somebody just needs to make a decision. And I'm just curious like how you kind of determine which way to go with that.
So this is where we get into the notion of reading the room, right? And really knowing the individuals in any group. And again, I'm talking about line manager stuff. So hopefully it's not more than 5 to 7 people that we're talking about in a given sort of logical grouping of folks. But you're absolutely right that there are people who tend to have strong opinions, strongly held. And that's why I frame it this way. And of course, I stole this from someone that I really respect. When you have somebody that's being really stubborn like that, you can use this framework to help them sort of deconstruct their own thought processes, right? The best possible outcome is when you see it as a pattern, you sit them down and say, you're really harming your own career and the people around you by continuing to just latch on to things and, beat them into the ground. You're slowing down progress because you're not allowing concord to form. And, hopefully that's enough. If it's not enough, then you kind of have to ratchet it up and say, once you sort of sense a, consensus developing, it doesn't matter if somebody's like honked off. This is like, okay, I'm making a call and we're going to move on. And, this is where in the one-on-ones, you really talk to people about, okay, there's going to be a certain amount of dissent and commit. If you get overridden, right, no matter how strongly you feel, sometimes if I say you're going to do it because I said so, you're going to do it because I said so. And we can talk about the reasons behind closed doors, but not in front of the group, because we're not doing a therapy session for you in front of all your colleagues. So being able to articulate, I think, the reasons for that, and also be able to just like read back to people, this is what I'm seeing. I'm seeing you dominate the conversations. I'm seeing you get really latched onto things that, are you sure that they matter? Because I'm not seeing why it's so important. And sometimes it really helps to like have, that sort of freewheeling discussion behind closed doors to get to the basis of like, what's the emotion behind it? In the case of the person that I think that we're both sort of indirectly talking about, what he told me was he was always worried that, a bad decision was going to land up back on his plate, that somebody else was going to go and do a thing based on the bad decision, and it was going to be all screwed up, and he was going to be on call, and he'd have to fix it, and he'd be really resentful, and no. It was kind of BS. And when I, pointed out that it was mostly BS, he kind of started to relent. Like, it didn't happen all at once, but he definitely softened. Now, it wasn't uniformly like he went from awful to awesome, in the space of a week or a conversation or whatever. But like, he definitely, like, people kept coming to me like, oh wow, so and so is really, much more likely than he used to be to, accept something that, he initially was opposed to. So like, you're trying to train people up to not like be little copies of yourself, but to try to see the same things that you see from your leadership role and give them the opportunities to support you in your leadership role, to not like fight you or slow down the team or, discourage team members' contributions. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording here. Boop.